Just imagine, the night at the cemetery was cold and silent, shrouded in a deep darkness that seemed to swallow everything around it. As a night security guard, you had grown accustomed to the eerie atmosphere and the faint sounds of the breeze passing through the trees. It was a lonely job, but you found a strange peace in the monotonous routine and the distant murmurs of the wind. However, that night, there was something different, something disturbing that made every hair on your body stand up. The memory of the previous night's nightmare was still vivid in your mind. In it, you had been attacked by an angry old woman whose grave had been violated. Her wrinkled face and hate-filled eyes seemed so real that you could almost feel the icy touch of her skeletal hands squeezing your neck. She screamed unintelligible words and the sound echoed in your mind, even after you woke up. Waking up from this dream was a momentary relief, but the feeling of fear and despair did not leave you. As you walked through the narrow halls of tombstones, lit only by the weak glow of the flashlight in your hands, you couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Your footsteps echoed eerily, each one seeming louder and more insistent than the last. The cold breeze, which had previously felt like a gentle touch, now felt sharp and menacing. Suddenly you felt a presence, as if someone was watching you from the shadows. Your heart raced, beating frantically against your chest. Your eyes strained to see in the darkness, and then you saw it. A mysterious, hazy figure stood there, just a few feet away, staring at you. The figure didn't move, it simply stood there, motionless, like a sinister statue. Its outlines were vague, but there was something undeniably human about its silhouette, something that sent waves of terror down your spine. Trying to calm your mind, you wondered if it was real or just a hallucination caused by the residual exhaustion and fear from the nightmare. But the figure didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to grow clearer with each passing second. You felt an oppressive presence, as if the very darkness surrounding you was drawing closer, growing denser and more suffocating. With a trembling hand, you raised the flashlight towards the figure, hoping the light would dispel the illusion. However, the figure remained. Its features were still vague, but eyes could be made out, glowing like embers in the darkness, fixed on you with an intensity that chilled your blood. Then the figure began to move, slowly and deliberately, towards him. Each step seemed to ring like thunder in his ears, the sound echoing in the deathly silence of the cemetery. Panic began to take hold of you. It was as if he was caught in a trap, with no way out, no hope. Primal, irrational fear dominated his thoughts. You turned, trying to flee, but your feet felt heavy, as if they were glued to the ground. The figure continued to approach, relentless, its presence growing in intensity and malevolence. You tried to scream, but your voice was drowned out by terror. The words were lost in a hoarse whisper that could barely be heard. The figure came closer and closer, and you could feel a deadly cold emanating from it, penetrating your skin and bones. The darkness surrounding you seemed to pulse with a life of its own, matching the frantic rhythm of your heart. The scene that was a simple night job at the cemetery turned into a nightmare. Fear gripped you, paralyzing your muscles and taking your breath away. The figure seemed to get closer, becoming clearer and clearer, and you knew you were about to face something inexplicable, something that transcended human understanding. The line between nightmare and reality blurred, and you found yourself caught in a surreal horror, desperately trying to unravel the mystery of that shadowy figure that now haunted you. With every step you took, your desperation increased, and the certainty that this night would be different from all the others became firm in your mind. As the figure came closer, you realized you could no longer run away. It was as if the darkness itself was conspiring against you, holding you in place, forcing you to face the inevitable. And then, in the height of despair, the figure stopped, just an arm's length away. Its eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce your very soul, and you felt like somehow this entity knew everything about you. Your fears, your weaknesses, and the nightmare you just had. With the last spark of courage you could muster, you raised the flashlight once more, fingers nearly frozen with fear. The light revealed, for a brief moment, a face twisted in an expression of anger and sadness, eyes locked with yours, before the flashlight fell from its shaking hand and the darkness swallowed it whole. I hope you liked the story, because the second story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. Imagine Junior and Tiago were two 16-year-old teenagers who had known each other since they were little. They lived in a small rural town, where everyone knew everyone. When the opportunity to work as caretakers at the local cemetery came up, they accepted more out of curiosity than money. The cemetery was in the oldest part of town, surrounded by tall old trees that cast long, sinister shadows. That particular night, the sky was covered in dark clouds that blocked out the light of the stars and the moon. Only the dim light of an old street lamp illuminated the path between the tombstones. The wind whistled through the trees, making a rustling sound. Junior and Tiago walked slowly, trying not to be frightened by the noises they heard. Dry leaves crunched under their feet, creating a sound that seemed to echo in the silence of the night. Suddenly, the two stopped. There, a few meters away, near an old and worn tombstone, they saw a man. He looked ghostly, dressed in clothes that seemed to be taken from a 1950s movie. A black suit, a narrow tie, and a felt hat. In one hand, he held a cup of coffee, from which a gentle steam was coming out, as if the coffee was hot despite the freezing night. The man stared at a specific tombstone, with a sad and lost look. Scared, but also curious, Junior and Tiago took a few steps back, without taking their eyes off the man. They decided to go to the small cabin of the cemetery caretaker, an old man named Seu Anselmo, who had worked there for decades. They knocked on the door and, when Mr. Anselmo opened it, they quickly told him what they had seen. Don Anselmo, with his tired eyes, listened attentively and, with a mysterious smile, invited them in. Sitting around a wooden table, with a candle lighting up the room, Don Anselmo began to tell a story that seemed to be taken from a horror book. "You saw the ghost of the cafe," he began. "This man, whose name was Joaquim, lived many years ago. He was a young businessman, married with a small son. Every day he passed by the cemetery on his way to work and always stopped to have a coffee, sitting near the cemetery. The tombstone you saw was the place where your parents were buried, and having a coffee there was a way to feel close to them." Junior and Tiago's eyes widened as Seu Anselmo continued the story. One day something terrible happened. Joaquim received devastating news. His wife and son had died in a car accident. He was inconsolable and began spending more and more time in the cemetery, sitting by the tombstone, with his cup of coffee. Over time, he began to waste away, consumed by sadness until, one day, he simply disappeared. They say his spirit was trapped here, condemned to wander the nights with his cup of coffee, trapped in his own pain and longing. The boys fell silent, processing the story. They felt a mixture of fear and compassion for the ghost. Mr. Anselmo looked at them and said, "Joaquim doesn't hurt anyone. He's just stuck in a cycle of sadness. But you have to be careful not to get in his way. Some things from the past need to remain intact." That night, Junior and Tiago couldn't sleep. Images of Joaquim's ghost and tragic story kept haunting their minds. They decided that the next night they would return to the cemetery to try to learn more about Joaquim's story and, perhaps, help him find peace. When the next night came, they returned to the cemetery. The scenery was the same. The whistling of the wind, the shadows of the trees, and the dim light of the street lamps. They walked to the tombstone where they had seen Joaquim. This time he wasn't there, but something felt different. Sitting next to the tombstone, they found an old, dusty diary. With shaking hands, Junior opened the diary and began to read. It was Joaquim's diary, filled with pages that spoke of his life, his family, and most of all, his pain after the tragedy. The last pages were almost illegible, with scribbled words and tear stains. One sentence, however, was clear: "If I could see them one last time, maybe I could rest." The boys knew they had to do something. They decided to look for Mr. Anselmo again. Upon hearing about the diary, Mr. Anselmo suggested a solution. An ancient legend said that if someone could gather the spirit's most beloved belongings and place them on his tombstone, the spirit could finally find peace. Determined, Junior and Tiago began to search for the objects. They knew the coffee cup was one of the items, but they needed to find more. With Mr. Anselmo's help, they discovered that Joaquim had a pocket watch, a gift from his wife, and a small toy car that belonged to his son. The following nights were spent finding these items. After days of searching, they managed to gather all the objects and took them to the cemetery. Under the light of the full moon, they placed the coffee cup, the pocket watch, and the toy car on Joaquim's tombstone. The moment they placed the last object, a strong wind began to blow, as if the entire cemetery was breathing a sigh of relief. They saw a soft light envelop the tombstone, and, for a brief moment, Joaquim's ghost appeared, looking at them with a grateful smile. Then, slowly, he disappeared, as if carried by the wind. Junior and Tiago felt a deep peace. They knew they had helped Joaquim find the rest he so desperately needed. And although they would never forget that experience, they knew that the cemetery was now a slightly less gloomy place. And so, the story of the coffee ghost became a legend in the small town, remembered by everyone as a reminder that sometimes it is necessary to reveal the secrets of the past so that we can find peace in the present. I hope you liked the story, because the third story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. I hope you liked the story. Have you ever had the experience of spending your holidays in a place that no one would ever imagine? Well, I spent my holidays in a very peculiar place. Cemeteries. Yes, that's right, those silent places, full of stories and memories engraved in marble and granite. It was a family custom to visit these places, and, at first, I found it all fascinating. My favorite pastime was to calculate people's ages from the dates on their tombstones. It was almost a game, a mathematical challenge with a dark twist. But over time, something began to bother me. Walking among the graves, I noticed a disturbing number of tombstones dedicated to young women and their babies, all marked with dates that revealed tragedies during childbirth. Suddenly, that youthful enthusiasm of mine was replaced by a deep melancholy. Each tombstone that was once a mathematical puzzle now seemed like a silent cry of pain and loss. These family visits became something more than a morbid lesson in arithmetic. They became a painful reflection on the fragility of life and the invisible sacrifices that make up our history. As I grew older, I came to see these visits to the cemetery not just as a curious excursion, but as an opportunity to understand more about life and death. My parents, with their calm way of walking through the aisles of tombstones, taught me much without having to say a word. I remember one hot summer afternoon when the sun shed its golden light on the old tombstones. My mother stopped in front of a tombstone on which two dates were engraved, one of birth and one of death, just a few months later. Next to it, there was another tombstone, smaller and simpler, with the name of a baby who lived only a few days. "They are like stories interrupted," my mother murmured, gently touching the cold stone. She explained how each name, each date, represented a life cut short prematurely, leaving behind a tangle of unanswered questions and unfulfilled dreams. My father, more reserved, preferred to read the inscriptions on the oldest tombstones. He told me about people whose stories were lost to time, whose names were forgotten, but whose lives were still revered there. He said that cemeteries were like silent libraries, where we could learn about the past and reflect on the uncertain future. As I grew older, these visits became less about solving math puzzles and more about honoring the lives laid to rest there. I read the messages left on the tombstones, some poetic, others simply a name and a date. Each told a story of love, loss, hope, and grief. But there was something else about cemeteries that began to intrigue me: the abandoned graves and forgotten corners. At the edges of graveyards, where shadows lengthened and the wind rustled through the trees, were broken and moss-covered tombstones, silent witnesses to untold stories. One evening, while exploring one of these forgotten corners, I came across a tombstone whose name had been erased by time. The inscription was worn and almost illegible, but something about the place made me feel a presence, as if an ancient story was trying to emerge from the shadows. At night, when the cemeteries were shrouded in deep silence and the wind rustled the leaves of the trees, I imagined the lives behind those tombstones. Stories of love and tragedy, of adventure and regret, all woven into the fabric of time. It was as if each stone were a chapter in a huge, mysterious book, whose pages were open to anyone who cared to read. It was then that I realized that cemeteries were not only places of mourning, but also of celebration of life. Each tombstone, with its name engraved on it, represented a person who had somehow left their mark on the world. And while many stories ended sadly and prematurely, there was beauty in the way those who visited them remembered and honored their lives. Thus, what began as a curious hobby became a journey of understanding about life and death, where each tombstone held not only a name, but a narrative of love, hope, and sometimes a premature goodbye. Tell me which story made your hair stand on end? Tell me which one you liked the most? Because in the next video the story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories.